The year was 1739, and the colony of South Carolina had become a ticking time bomb. In the sweltering heat of late summer, as Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, 20 enslaved Africans gathered in the pre-dawn darkness near the murky waters of the Stono River. The air was thick with humidity and tension, carrying whispers of revolution that had been spreading through the slave quarters for months. CTA moment. Before we dive into the most brutal and significant slave uprising in colonial American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. What you're about to hear will shock you to your core and reveal truths that have been buried for centuries. South Carolina in 1739 was a society built on a foundation of human suffering and racial terror. The colony's wealth flowed from rice plantations worked by enslaved Africans who possessed knowledge their white masters could never match. These weren't just laborers. They were skilled engineers who had transformed the coastal lowlands into profitable agricultural empires. Yet they lived in constant fear, subjected to whippings, brandings, and executions for the smallest infractions. The demographics told a terrifying story for white colonists. Enslaved people outnumbered whites by nearly 2 to 1. In some parishes, the ratio was even more dramatic. Charlestown itself was a majority black city, where enslaved people worked as artisans, dock workers, street vendors, and domestic servants. They spoke multiple languages, maintained African cultural traditions, and most importantly, they communicated across plantation lines. At the center of this brewing storm was Jemmy, an Angolan man whose literacy set him apart in a world where teaching enslaved people to read was increasingly forbidden. Unlike many of his fellow bondsmen, Jemmy could decipher the political currents swirling around the Atlantic world. He knew that Spain and England were moving toward war, and he understood the implications of Spanish promises echoing from St. Augustine. The Spanish had been actively undermining British colonial slavery for years, offering freedom and land grants to any enslaved person who could reach Florida. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a deliberate military strategy designed to destabilize England's most profitable colonies. Small groups of runaways had already made the dangerous journey south, and word of their success had spread through the Carolina Lowcountry like wildfire through dry rice stubble. But Jemmy's plan went far beyond individual escape. He envisioned something that would strike terror into the heart of every white plantation owner from Virginia to Georgia, a mass uprising that would demonstrate to the world that enslaved Africans would no longer accept bondage without violent resistance. The time for quiet endurance had ended. As September 9th dawned, Jemmy gathered his most trusted allies in the gray half-light before sunrise. These weren't desperate men acting on impulse. They were seasoned warriors, many from the Kingdom of Congo, where they had served as soldiers before European slave traders had ripped them from their homeland. They possessed military knowledge that their masters had tried to beat out of them, but which had survived in whispered conversations and carefully preserved memories. The timing was calculated with military precision. Sunday morning meant that most white men would be gathered in churches, temporarily concentrating the armed population and leaving plantations less defended. A new security act requiring all white men to carry firearms to Sunday services wasn't scheduled to take effect for another 3 weeks, meaning many would be unarmed. The rebels had identified a narrow window of opportunity, and they were prepared to exploit it with deadly efficiency. As the sun climbed over the Carolina horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood red and gold, 20 determined men made their way through the marshy lowlands toward their first target, Hutchinson's store at Stono Bridge. Their bare feet moved silently through the morning dew as they approached what would become the epicenter of the bloodiest slave rebellion in colonial American history. Hutchinson's store wasn't chosen randomly. It was the key to everything that would follow. The establishment sold firearms, gunpowder, and ammunition to local planters and militiamen. For enslaved people planning an armed uprising, it represented the difference between futile rebellion and effective warfare. Without weapons, they would be nothing more than angry victims. With them, they could become soldiers fighting for their freedom. The 2 storekeepers manning the shop on that fateful Sunday morning had no warning of what was coming. They likely knew some of the faces approaching their establishment. Enslaved people often ran errands for their masters, and the store served the entire surrounding community. But these familiar faces now carried an unfamiliar hardness, a determination that spoke of desperation and deadly purpose. The attack was swift and merciless. The crack of gunfire shattered the peaceful Sunday morning quiet as the rebels struck without warning. The storekeepers fell where they stood, becoming the first casualties of what contemporary records would describe as the most serious slave rebellion of the colonial period. Their blood soaked into the wooden floors as the rebels methodically armed themselves with muskets, pistols, powder, and shot. This was just the beginning of a day that would forever change American slavery. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will leave you speechless. With weapons in their hands, the rebels were transformed. They were no longer property to be bought and sold. They were armed revolutionaries fighting for the most basic human right, freedom. The psychological transformation was as important as the physical one. For the first time in their lives in America, they held the power of life and death over their oppressors. From Hutchinson's store, the band moved with military discipline through the Carolina countryside. Their next target was the house of Robert Godfrey, a planter known for his particularly brutal treatment of enslaved people. The rebels surrounded his home as the morning sun climbed higher, trapping the family inside. There would be no mercy for those who had shown none. Godfrey's house erupted in flames as the rebels set it ablaze. The planter died alongside his son and daughter, their screams lost in the roar of consuming fire. The message was unmistakable. The days of white terror over black bodies had come to an end, at least for this day. The smoke rising from the burning house served as a signal to enslaved people throughout the region that liberation was at hand. As they moved from house to house, the rebels demonstrated that their violence wasn't random or mindless. At Wallace's Tavern, they made a decision that revealed the calculated nature of their uprising. The innkeeper, known for treating his enslaved workers with relative kindness, was spared. His life was a testament to their ability to distinguish between degrees of oppression. But for others, there would be no such mercy. The rebels understood that their survival depended on striking fear into the hearts of their oppressors. Every white person killed sent a message that the system of racial domination could be challenged and overthrown. By the time the morning was half over, 6 more houses had been attacked and their inhabitants killed, adding to the growing body count that would eventually reach 25 white colonists. The rebels moved with purpose along the main road, their numbers beginning to swell as word spread of their success. Other enslaved people, hearing the gunfire and seeing the smoke, began to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Some joined willingly, eager for their first taste of freedom in years or decades of bondage. Others were compelled to join, recognizing that neutrality was no longer an option in a war between the enslaved and their masters. By 11 o'clock on that September morning, what had begun as a carefully planned military strike had evolved into something far more powerful and dangerous, a mass movement for liberation. The rebels' numbers had swollen from the original 20 to nearly 60 men, women, and children, with more joining their ranks every hour as word spread through the slave quarters of the surrounding plantations. The sound that would haunt white South Carolinians for generations began to echo across the countryside, the rhythmic beating of drums, accompanied by voices raised in defiant chants of liberty. Liberty! Liberty! This wasn't merely noise. It was psychological warfare designed to strike terror into the hearts of their oppressors, while simultaneously calling every enslaved person within earshot to join their cause. The rebels marched with military precision down the main road leading south toward the Spanish colony of Florida. They carried a banner that boldly proclaimed their purpose: liberty. The word that white colonists had claimed as their own during conflicts with Britain was now being wielded by those they had enslaved, exposing the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of colonial society. CTA moment. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a declaration of war against slavery itself. Hit that like button if you're learning something that textbooks never taught you about American history. The sight of armed enslaved people marching openly down a public road was unprecedented in colonial America. For decades, whites had lived with the constant fear that their property might one day turn against them, but that fear had always seemed abstract. Now it was terrifyingly real, complete with drums, banners, and the bodies of dead masters left in their wake. Lieutenant Governor William Bull's encounter with the rebels has become one of the most documented moments of the uprising. Traveling by horseback with 5 companions from Charleston to his plantation, Bull spotted the armed band from a distance. The sight that greeted him must have been his worst nightmare made manifest. Dozens of armed enslaved people marching boldly down a public road in broad daylight, openly defying every law and custom of colonial society. Bull's survival was largely due to luck and the rebels' focus on their larger mission. Rather than pursue individual whites they encountered, they maintained their discipline and continued their march southward. Bull managed to turn his horse around and race back toward Charleston, his mind undoubtedly reeling from what he had witnessed. His warning would prove crucial in organizing the white response, but for now, the rebels controlled miles of Carolina countryside. The military background of many rebels became increasingly evident in their organization and tactics. These weren't desperate people acting on impulse. They were experienced warriors drawing on knowledge gained in African conflicts before their enslavement. Many had served as soldiers in the Kingdom of Congo, where warfare was a sophisticated art involving complex strategies and disciplined troop movements. As they marched, the rebels systematically attacked plantations and killed whites who fell into their path. The violence wasn't random, it was strategic, designed to cripple the local power structure while preventing organized resistance. Each plantation they struck was one less source of armed opposition, one less stronghold of white power in a region they were rapidly coming to dominate. The psychological impact of their march extended far beyond the immediate area. News of armed enslaved people killing their masters and marching toward Spanish territory struck at the deepest fears of every white person in the colony. This wasn't just a local disturbance, it was an existential threat to the entire system of racial oppression that made their wealth and way of life possible. By afternoon, their numbers had grown to nearly 100 participants. They had covered over 10 miles, leaving a trail of destruction that would be remembered for generations. Behind them lay the bodies of more than 20 whites and the smoldering ruins of multiple plantations. Ahead lay the promise of Spanish Florida and freedom, if they could reach it alive. As the late afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the South Carolina lowcountry, the rebels made a decision that would ultimately seal their fate. After marching more than 10 miles and killing over 20 whites, they halted in a large field near the Stono River to rest, celebrate their unprecedented success, and attract more recruits to their cause. The field erupted in a celebration unlike anything colonial America had ever witnessed. Drums thundered across the landscape as the rebels danced, sang, and proclaimed their freedom to anyone within miles. The music was both African and American, drawing on cultural traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and the brutality of plantation life. For these men and women, many of whom had not experienced a moment of true joy since their enslavement, this celebration was a declaration of their humanity. The drumming served multiple purposes beyond celebration. In West and Central African cultures, drums were sophisticated communication devices capable of transmitting complex messages across vast distances. The rhythms echoing from the field near Stono River weren't just music, they were calls to arms, invitations to join the rebellion, and proclamations that the impossible had become reality. This moment of celebration would soon turn into the deadliest confrontation in the history of American slavery. Don't forget to share this video to help spread this crucial but often overlooked history. As the rebels celebrated, enslaved people from surrounding plantations could hear the drums and understand their meaning. Some slipped away from their work to investigate, while others sent word through the complex communication networks that connected slave quarters across the region. The news spread like wildfire. Armed enslaved people were openly defying their masters and marching toward freedom. The celebration wasn't just emotional release, it was strategic psychological warfare. The sound of drums and voices raised in defiant song could be heard for miles, announcing to every enslaved person within earshot that liberation was possible. It also served to terrorize any whites in the vicinity, demonstrating that the rebels were confident enough in their power to openly celebrate their success. But while the rebels celebrated their freedom, their enemies were organizing a response. Lieutenant Governor Bull's warning had reached Charleston and surrounding communities, setting off a chain reaction of fear and preparation. Church services were interrupted as militiamen received word of the uprising. Plantation owners armed themselves and their overseers, while messages were dispatched to neighboring colonies requesting assistance. The South Carolina militia system had been designed specifically to deal with slave uprisings, and now it was being put to its ultimate test. Well-armed and experienced fighters began converging on the area, following the trail of destruction left by the rebels. These weren't amateur soldiers, they were planters, merchants, and professionals who had everything to lose if slavery was successfully challenged. Among the militia members mobilizing against the rebels were men who had served in European wars and conflicts with Native American tribes. They understood military tactics and possessed superior weapons and equipment. Most importantly, they were fighting to preserve not just their lives but their entire economic and social system. As afternoon turned toward evening, the rebels in the field remained unaware that their pursuers were closing in. The celebration continued as more enslaved people arrived to join their ranks, swelling their numbers to over 70 active participants. They had achieved something that had seemed impossible that morning. They had successfully organized and sustained the largest slave uprising in colonial American history. The field where they celebrated had become a symbol of black freedom and white fear. For a few precious hours, enslaved Africans had created a space where they could express joy, hope, and defiance without fear of punishment. It was a glimpse of what liberation might look like, and it was about to be crushed by overwhelming force. As dusk approached on September 9, 1739, the South Carolina militia finally converged on the field where the rebels continued their celebration. The colonial force, numbering between 20 and nearly 100 well-armed and mounted men, had been tracking the uprising throughout the day, following the trail of burned plantations and dead bodies that marked the rebels' march toward freedom. The confrontation that followed would become one of the defining moments in the history of American slavery. On one side stood 76 enslaved Africans armed with stolen weapons and fueled by desperate courage. On the other stood the cream of South Carolina's white male population, plantation owners, merchants, military veterans, and professionals who represented the full power of colonial society. The militia attacked with the fury of men who understood that their entire way of life hung in the balance. These weren't just enslaved people in rebellion. They were an existential threat to everything white South Carolinians held dear. Their wealth, their power, their sense of racial superiority, and their very lives depended on maintaining absolute control over the enslaved population. The rebels fought with the desperation of people who knew that surrender meant certain death. There would be no mercy for enslaved people who had killed their masters and challenged the fundamental assumptions of colonial society. They had crossed a line from which there was no return, and their only choices were victory or death. The battle that followed would determine the fate of slavery in colonial America. Make sure you're subscribed to see how this confrontation changed history forever. Gunfire erupted across the Carolina countryside as two worlds collided in deadly combat. The rebels, despite their courage and determination, faced overwhelming disadvantages. The militia possessed superior weapons, ammunition, and tactical training. More importantly, they fought from horseback, giving them mobility and psychological advantages that proved decisive in the open field. The sound of musket fire and the screams of dying men echoed across the landscape as the battle raged. Smoke from gunpowder mixed with the dust kicked up by charging horses and running men, creating a hellish scene that witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. This wasn't just a battle, it was a war between two irreconcilable visions of American society. When the smoke finally cleared and the last shots were fired, the statistics told a grim but significant story. 23 whites and 47 enslaved people lay dead on the field. But as historians have noted, the rebels had killed proportionately more whites than was the case in later rebellions. Even in defeat, they had proven their effectiveness as fighting men and demonstrated that enslaved people would not submit to bondage without violent resistance. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true depths of white fear and rage. The colonial authorities didn't simply kill the defeated rebels. They mutilated their bodies and displayed them as warnings to other enslaved people who might consider similar actions. The severed heads of rebellion leaders were mounted on stakes along major roadways, creating a grotesque gallery of death designed to crush any remaining thoughts of resistance. But not all the rebels had fallen at the Edisto River battlefield. A significant number had escaped into the swamps and forests of South Carolina, carrying with them the knowledge and experience gained from their day of freedom. These survivors represented an ongoing threat to colonial security, and their capture became an obsession for white authorities. Lieutenant Governor Bull immediately hired Chickasaw and Catawba Indians, along with enslaved people loyal to their masters, to track down and capture the survivors. The manhunt that followed would continue for days, as colonial authorities desperately tried to capture every last rebel. They understood that any survivor could become a symbol of resistance, inspiring future uprisings and proving that successful rebellion was possible. The battle at Edisto River had ended in defeat for the rebels, but it had achieved something equally important. It had shattered the myth of willing submission that white colonists used to justify slavery. The sight of armed enslaved people fighting professionally trained militiamen would haunt white imaginations for generations to come. 1 week after the massacre at Edisto River, approximately 30 miles from the original battlefield, the surviving rebels made their final desperate stand against the forces of colonial oppression. These men had been hunted through the South Carolina wilderness like wild animals, sleeping in swamps and living off whatever food they could find, but they refused to surrender their hard-won freedom without one last fight. The final confrontation was smaller, but no less significant than the first. The surviving rebels, numbering fewer than 50, had managed to regroup and arm themselves for one last attempt to reach Spanish Florida. They knew the odds were impossible, but they also understood that surrender meant certain death in the most brutal manner their captors could devise. When the militia finally cornered them, the rebels chose to fight rather than submit. The gunfire that echoed through the Carolina woods marked the end of organized resistance, but it also marked the beginning of a legend that would inspire enslaved people for generations to come. These men had chosen death over bondage, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten. George Cato, whose family oral history claimed descent from the rebellion's leaders, preserved a haunting account of the final surrender that reveals the unbroken spirit of the defeated rebels. According to Cato's testimony, passed down through generations of his family, the rebel commander addressed both his followers and their captors with words that encapsulated the meaning of their sacrifice. The words of these brave men still echo through history today. Hit that notification bell to make sure you never miss these powerful stories of resistance and courage. Commander Cato speak for the crowd. He say, "We don't like slavery. We start to join the Spanish in Florida. We surrender but we not whipped yet and we is not converted." The other 43 say, "Amen." They was taken, unarmed, and hanged by the militia. These words, preserved in African American oral tradition, reveal the uncompromising nature of the rebels' commitment to freedom. Even facing certain death, they refused to express regret for their actions or submit psychologically to their captors. They had tasted freedom for one glorious day, and no amount of torture or intimidation could make them forget that experience. The colonial authorities executed most of the captured rebels in the most public and brutal manner possible. Those who weren't hanged were sold to sugar plantations in the West Indies, a fate that many considered worse than death due to the horrific working conditions and shortened life expectancy on Caribbean plantations. The message was clear: rebellion against slavery would be met with the ultimate punishment. But the Stono rebellion's impact extended far beyond the immediate punishment of its participants. The uprising sent shockwaves throughout colonial America, forcing white authorities to confront the reality that their enslaved population would not remain passive indefinitely. The rebellion proved that enslaved people could organize effectively, fight skillfully, and pose a genuine threat to colonial security. In response to the uprising, the South Carolina General Assembly quickly passed the Negro Act of 1740, the most restrictive slave code in colonial American history. The new law prohibited enslaved people from growing their own food, assembling in groups, earning money for themselves, or learning to read and write. It also required harsh punishments for any enslaved person found with weapons or attempting to escape. The colony imposed a prohibitive duty on importing new enslaved people from Africa and the West Indies, fearing that recent arrivals might be more likely to rebel. Authorities also required a ratio of 1 white person for every 10 enslaved people on plantations, forcing planters to hire white overseers or risk legal penalties. These measures revealed the depth of fear that Jemmy's rebellion had instilled in the white population. The very existence of such restrictive laws demonstrated that the rebellion had achieved one of its primary goals, proving to the world that enslaved Africans would not accept bondage without violent resistance. Despite its ultimate failure, the Stono Rebellion established a template for resistance that would inspire enslaved people throughout American history. From Gabriel Prosser in Virginia to Nat Turner's rebellion to the Underground Railroad, the spirit of Stono lived on in every act of defiance against the peculiar institution of slavery. The rebels' cry of liberty took on prophetic significance as colonial Americans moved toward revolution against British rule. The same word that Jemmy and his followers had chanted while marching toward freedom would later become the rallying cry of white colonists seeking independence from Britain. The irony was not lost on those who remembered that enslaved Africans had claimed this principle first. The courage of these freedom fighters reminds us that the struggle for human dignity never ends. Subscribe to this channel and share this video to help ensure that their sacrifice is never forgotten. Their blood watered the seeds of freedom that would eventually grow into the broader movement for human rights in America. Though they died in bondage, their legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept injustice and oppression. The Stono Rebellion proved that the desire for freedom is stronger than any chain, and that ordinary people can change the course of history through extraordinary acts of courage. Their story deserves to be remembered, honored, and shared with every generation that follows.